Thank you very much, Simon Patterson, for meeting Studio International at your safari exhibition as Expedition here at the Warr Pavilion in Bexhill. For the opening of this show, you had a spectacle titled Seascape, and you introduced the work by saying, on the day that you introduced the work, you said that it's a daytime firework display using smoke, a bit like the Red Arrows, and about as sensible as Kevin Costner's Waterworld.
Yeah.
And that extraordinary eclectic references perhaps echoes William Burroughs' cut-up process. So can you talk a bit about how you came to bring together such a rich variety of concepts and the difference between the idea in your mind or your process of research and then the reality of it? How do you navigate that?
Well, I think it's about the difference between the notion of what you plan something to be, if that's what you mean. So you start out with an idea for you want to make this, and then you get excited about you want to make this, and then somebody says you can't do that because that's dangerous or that's too expensive or we haven't got time. And it's usually these are the factors, which sound a very negative way of talking about making things, but it's how you are edited by circumstances in the way you make things. It's a bit like. Sometimes it feels more like you're making, to draw an analogy with sculpture, sometimes it feels like you're chipping away at something, you're removing material from, say, stone rather than applying something like clay to an armature. So it feels often with the way works get made, sometimes initially feels like you're having to take away aspects and pare down the idea till you arrive at some shape or work at the end of it. And that isn't too folksy way of talking about it. But I think that hopefully that you ends up making a work that is different to the original idea. I mean, I've only once ever made a work where it was for a public work where I actually did the Photoshop presentation because they needed to know what they were going to get.
What was that?
It was the work for Compton Verney, which was the cosmic wallpaper.
Oh yes,
and
the deep purple.
The deep purple one. And it was very strange because I took a big photograph of it from the view that they did the Photoshop proposal of what it would look like. And I was initially incredibly disappointed because it looked, I know the content may have changed a bit, but the actual visual looked exactly like the Photoshop thing. So that was a very strange experience. It's something to be so like what I'd set out to do.
May I just ask you why deep purple?
Because they were sort of reasonably local to Warwick. I mean, not Warwick, but Midlands, and the band. But also, it was a work. It was in a public area on the back of a theatre at Warwick University, and they have a tradition, as you know, for collecting very good, strong with the Mead Gallery and everything, and they've collected a lot of contemporary work or modernist work as well. And it's all over the campus, and they've got a very fine history of that. But I like the idea of it being a work more for these sort of slightly aging professors and tutors than it was, the sort of thing they would have had on their poster on their bedroom wall. So the students have probably got no idea who it's referencing, because they're in the end the people that are there all the time. They're the kind of constant, or most of the time, rather than students who are there in transit, if you like. In transit, almost. And in the case of Seascape, I think it was the original. I think the curatorial team here at Delaware were definitely nudged me in terms of the works of my own work. They nudged me quite clearly in the direction of the work they wanted to borrow. So in that sense, the show was curated by Rosie and her curatorial team, Rosie Cooper and her curatorial team. In other respects, I'm resisting now. I'm trying to introduce new work, and so it looks like a work she should have curated the work from the various collections with my own work, the safari aspect of the show. But there's a bit of elbow barging going on between the two of us deliberately, and that. But that's the sort of thing I wanted to curate. So that's the work as an act of curation almost. And the Seascape work was definitely, as landscape, was on the list. It was requested. So the original idea would have been to have just set off the smoke grenades on the beach. And I suggested that to Rosie and everyone that it would be, if we could do it at sea, it would be great. And it would kind of chime very much with the idea of her plans of reaching out to local institutions and to clubs and being part. She's new here as well. She wanted to be part of the community and to make the gallery part of the community, not just to be some isolated repository of artworks. So I knew it would be technically difficult to do Seascape because you have so many, you've got too many variables, and the tide had to be right for the opening, and the wind, too much. You need wind to sail, but you don't want too much wind for the smoke, and it was almost too rough to sail that day. Hence my flippant remark about Waterworld. But it went way over budget and was hit by storms and all sorts of things. That's why it's that comment. So, I was aware it was a crazy thing to do, but I just thought if it was possible to do it, it would be a great thing to do for the exhibition. In terms of the eclecticism, that's I think all artists are magpies, and they tend to take ideas from elsewhere. And it is about putting them together. Maybe in some cases it's taking something that is apparently dead. We were talking before the interview started, off air if you like, about the idea of the way many students redeem old processes that art galleries think are now redundant, such as certain printing processes or analog photography or analog recording. I've seen, people are obsessed, students are obsessed by some of these old technologies. I think I've got my own theories for why that is. I think partly it's because you have a physical thing. It is, the object is as interesting as the result. It's also that you can treat it in a more formalist way. If you have a video camera, you can make an endless documentary or an endless interview, with a digital. But if you're using old-fashioned video with a cassette, then you're limited to chunks of time before you have to cut and change the cassette. So it means that it's the length of a roll of film. It's that determines the shape of something. Say it was a 35mm film, it would be a 7-minute take you could do, and then you'd have to change the film. So I think initially, I think people are collecting the sense as redeeming things. That's one form of sort of eclecticism. It's like a bit like hoarders with newspapers piled up in their flat and you can't get in the front door. I think sometimes artists' minds are a bit like that, and that you find some artists just a pair of feet sticking out and it's all collapsed on them somehow and they've lost the plot. Or keeping every football program, or keeping everything, and it's that as collecting again. It's going back to that and that kind of eclecticism. But really, what you're asking about is eliding different, apparently unrelated ideas to make something else. So it might be taking several components that seem to be obsolete and useless and destined for scrap heap, but finding a new use for them. So they're not. So you're putting them together. That creates a third thing, a second. Maybe several things that are apparently useless, but actually create something. Because art, in its nature, is useless in one respect, in a functional way. So what's it for?
Blimey, can you answer that?
I don't think I can answer that actually today. Sometimes I think I know the answer, and sometimes I don't. I think it's partly because you're always looking for that answer, and the only problem is if you get just frustrated and unable to keep asking the question. I think it's the means of support, which is, I know, something you want to talk about later, but that's the most difficult thing, because it's the desire to keep asking apparently asking the same question over and over and again, but you're asking in a slightly nuanced way each time.
I'd like to ask you a question which is slightly related to that, and that's about the position that you take as an artist. You spoke about your 2002 video work, Escape Routine, in which you have flight attendants performing magic tricks and Houdini's text on the craft of escaping. And at the time you said it's a sort of performance art that I couldn't make. And so artists today position themselves in different ways. Can you tell us about how you position yourself in the art industry?
Well, I think that's a big question. I think in terms specifically to answer it, is maybe if I'd start by answering in the specifics of Escape Routine, that it was, I think many of the subjects in the show are, for example, Cousteau or Houdini. These figures for me are sort of surrogates, or they're alter egos in some way. And in the same way that the works, they stand in for, maybe just evoking their name might stand in for the person or whatever. And I think artists want to be, they're a bit like actors. They feel this isn't really a proper job, being an artist. It's a bit like sort of, Robert Mitchum never really felt it was a proper job being an actor, or people like Gregory Peck, they were seemed to be too smart and didn't take it that seriously, but made some good films, But so they feel this healthy ambivalence towards what they're doing. They don't feel entirely uncomfortable with doing that. And I think those are stand-ins, a bit like a stand-in, for an actor. And they're like a stand-in for me. In the same way that the whole exhibition is particularly the safari element of the exhibition is a stand-in for me in a way, and it's a stand. Because I think that it's partly a joke about the whole way that retrospectives or mini retrospectives or anthologies, whatever, are the wonder of me. They're sort of they are of course about the artist. It's about their work, and people are bound to want to know about the artist because you've got all the work. So it's the dog that doesn't bark in the night. That's the thing that is not present in the exhibition is the artist, and they want to know, well, can tell us a bit more about their background or why they're doing this, rather than actually just saying, well, let's just look at the work on its own merit. So it's a way of doing that, and that the safari bit is a way of dealing with that, if you like. So they might be sort of things that I'm fascinated by, but there are lots of in-jokes. There are lots of things that works, like I was saying about things standing in for the real object. So you have, as I said about Piltdown Man, you have that as a fake. You have fakers, artists feeling that they're not entirely, that they may be bullshitting a bit about the subject. They're often skating pretty much on thin ice because this is a subject they have just learned in order to make the work. They're fascinated with, so they're not the expert. They will meet the expert on that, but they're not. It's not about expertise. It's about finding something else that they need from that subject to make the work. So they always feel like they are fraudulent. They're not specialists. They're generalists. Or I am. It's probably unfair to generalize about other people. Generalize about generalists. Well, I'm not. Yes, I think going back to this sort of thing about being that sort of generalist as artist rather than generalist in terms of the knowledge that you need to make the work. In the case of Escape Routine, it did come out of the whole thing about just flying backwards and forwards a lot to Zurich when I was doing a show there on Swiss Air, and I was just amused by this sort of very sort of fascist sort of upholstery and the whole sort of interior of the aircraft with the very smart attendants and the fetishistic aspect of Swiss, as it then was Swiss Air before it was Swiss, and the boredom of flying. And even though that you're being presented with this routine that is about we're all going to die, but we're just presenting this very matter-of-fact way. And most of the rituals there are just purely for the brace position is purely about keeping you in your seat and being able to locate your teeth for identification later, that sort of thing. To be grim about it, that's what it's sort of about. But we just kind of go along with this as if it's some kind of health and safety thing. And it was the fact that it's performed. So to take something that is every day and to turn that into something else, into a performance, appealed to me. And I knew it had to be an airline that was like pretty stiff. So it was either Swiss, I approached them and it didn't happen. Then it was Japanese airlines through a friend, as my Japanese friend described the flight attendants as automata, which I thought was quite amusing. Only he could say that. And or British Airways, and it ended up being with British Airways, which was perfect because or Lufthansa, had to be, couldn't be a budget airline. It had to be something that was more about the, how can I put it, the sort of highly formalistic flight safety demonstration. And so these are, again, stand-ins for me. So using other people to do the performance. I'm not a performance artist, but I like the idea of making a work that was to do about performance in some way. So the Houdini texts that are used are various texts that are just about his advice on stagecraft. And so it might be just how you address an audience, or it might be how you walk onto the stage, or how you look people in the eye, all this sort of thing. So going back to this thing of misdirection as well, and so that is this work is you have the English and Japanese. It's in two halves. It's about doubling, male and female. All the crew are couples. Some are actual magicians and some are actual flight attendants, all mixed up. And with the actual safety demonstration doubling with the Houdini escapes. So it all doubling, so it becomes much longer than the real safety demonstration. And it's about, male, female, left and right in one respect. It's about, which is a work I explored later with another video, very short video, a film work, which is just a 3 1-minute section film called Timepiece. That is not in the exhibition, but it was also about doubling male-female, but it was more specifically about that, just that subject. And to sort of briefly answer your question, I'd say it's more about them being stand-ins for me. So it's like actors being surrogates.
ライフジャケットは皆様のシートの下にございます。陶器がやむを得ず水上に着陸した場合、ライフジャケットを袋から取り出し、頭からかぶってご着用ください。紐を腰に巻き、体の横でしっかりと2度縛ってください。赤い留め具を引っ張っていただくと、ライフジャケットを膨らませることができます。膨らみの足りないときは、このチューブを使って口で空気を入れください。ライフジャケットには自動的に点灯するライトと合図を送るために吹く笛もついています。機外に出られるまではライフジャケットを膨らまさないでください。赤ちゃんのための救命ベッドやお子様用のライフジャケットも用意してございます。高速服、すなわちストレートジャケットという言葉は、それ自体で凶暴な狂人のイメージと身の毛もよだつようなことに引き込まれてしまうような思いを喚起します。ストレートジャケットは丈夫な茶色のキャンバスまたは帆布でできており、革製の高い襟首と同じく革製の袖口がついております。ストレートジャケットの開口部は背中にあり、革紐とバックルを使って後ろで留めるようになっております。違う素材を使ったいろいろなストレートジャケットがございますが、中には全て革で作ったものもございます。もちろん曲がりにくい硬い素材でできたものは脱出するのがより難しく、より時間が必要になります。袖口は袋状に縫い付けて手が出ないようにしてあり、その先には革のベルトがついておりますが、その先端についている革紐と鋼鉄製バックルで両の手を背中に回して止めてしまうのでございます。脱出するためには途方もない回転運動に耐え、最後にジャケットから何とか抜け出すのでございます。偽物のマジシャンは普通引っ張り上げて頭から脱げるようなストレートジャケットを用意しております。もちろんそれらはトリックのストレートジャケットで、本物のストレートジャケットと一緒にしてはなりません。長期間出演するときはそれぞれのパフォーマンスごとに違うチャレンジを引き受けるようお勧めいたします。どうぞこれらの指示を厳密に守ることが 非常に重要であるということをお忘れにならないようにしてください。
There's something else that seems to be happening in your work, and something that you talked about a little earlier, which is about wanting to take things out of the gallery space, and these spectacles that you direct and make, and with the
well, the escape routine was meant to take place on an aircraft. It was meant to be performed. Original idea was, proposal to Swiss Air was, it happened on an
so
aeroplane.
Making extraordinary things happen in people's real world, and you're taking it out of this.
But you find, that's true, but you find whenever you think you're doing something like that, if you think you're doing that, you always find the real world trumps you. So, for example, when I was looking, when the film was made, the escape routine was made in conjunction with Locust Plus and various other people, but it was also, we went around looking at flight training centres, and it was only the British Airways one, which was the best, but we looked at a budget airline one, and when I went into the cockpit of one of this simulated aircraft, the fuselage, it was too small to film on, it wasn't a wide-bodied aircraft, so we couldn't use it in the end, but it had in the, this is just post 9/11, it has in the aircraft cockpit a cabinet which you open, and it has, this is even before flight marshals, whatever they're called, air marshals, they had like handcuffs and things in the cabinet. So if you had somebody who goes crazy, which does quite often happen, goes, let me out, and wants to open the door at 30,000 feet, they can cuff somebody up and stop, you know. So all this is already there, you know, all these things that I thought were quite amusing to introduce, like handcuffs or something, were already there. So that was, as I say, the real world trumps you in that respect. You will always think that, or someone will say, didn't you know that so-and-so used to live here, or some bit of history, some obscure bit of history, that suddenly absolutely ties in with the work you're making. And you find out after you've made the work. It's just a really nice happenstance.
You made a piece of work, a tribute to Wilfred Owen. The
work was called La Maison Forestière. It's a commemoration of Wilfred Owen's work. It's in Ors, depending which, you can pronounce it either way, depending Flemish or French, because it's in Flanders. And it's a house that I was commissioned by Art Connects in Lille to propose a public project in Ors to somehow commemorate Wilfred Owen. So we always talked about around Wilfred Owen as the original idea, a work around him, rather than trying to make. They didn't want. It was very clear that the commune, the three towns that commissioned this work originally, Art Connects were the interlocutor with the agent and enabler who I work with. That the house, it wasn't specifically going to be about the house. It was just a work. They didn't want they were very clear what they didn't want. They didn't want a museum. They didn't want statue. They didn't want, you know, the usual public art solutions to something like that. And there is in the just outside the town in the forest is the forester's house, where Owen in the basement wrote his famous last letter home to his mother, and where he describes the conditions of the cellar. And it's just a really tiny carve, and the house is a sort of late 19th century bog standard red brick house that you see all over that part of Flanders. And so my proposal was to completely gut the house and turn it into the back of the house to make a very large ramp that goes down to the cellar, which is only 2 meters down, to create a kind of Odeon at the back, an outdoor Odeon. And then the house was, the floor and the ceilings were open right up. The chimney was taken out the middle, which is structural. So it was one of those cases like you see with facades that are just propped up. A case of taking a house, and it's more expensive to preserve the house than it is to knock it down and build something new. So it was the house, the cellar was the only historical bit in terms of Owen, but the house turned it into a space where his poetry is projected and is read by Kenneth Branagh and a French actor in French. There's some French translations of his poetry, and so you have projections inside, and then you can go down. People were coming there to just visit the cellar, so the cellar's kept intact.
Can I ask you about this is a very different process, it seems.
So I designed it as a building, basically. So it became an architectural project for me, if you like.
But also its focus, or its purpose, is rather different to other works that you've done.
It is and it isn't, because it's not functional. It is. They didn't want a museum or a library, or they'd already, So you go there. There's no shop. There's no loo. If you want to go to the loo there, you have to go over the road. There's an estaminet there, just over the road. And hopefully that's open, or you go in the woods. And so it is apparently functional in the sense that it's a visitor attraction. So it fulfills that function. That from the point of view of this commune of these 3 villages that were behind me doing this project, they liked it, but they didn't have the money to build it. So we had to go to sort of the European Union, to the local region, to the French central government, and to France, Fondation de France, which is a very generous private foundation, to fund the project. So it was like €1.5 million at the time. That's a really big budget for me, or for anyone, but to do a project. So it wasn't a work, I would never indulge making my own work on that scale. It would be sort of obscene. But it was functional in one respect, that it fulfilled the need of a community. And it was nice because it was grassroots up, rather than it being, a lot of French public art is centralized. It's determined by Paris that you will have, and then the region determines that we will have the turd in the plaza, the sculpture in the plaza. In this instance, this is also the remit of groups like Art Connexion, that they don't want to work that way, and they're regarded as slightly odd, a bit of the cuckoo in the nest in terms of public art in France, because they are trying to start things from the kind of grassroots level.
Is it a memorial?
No, it's absolutely not a memorial. It's very important. I get quite snippy when people say that, because that's whenever it was reported, it was always called a memorial. You have to accept that, because it's also painted white. It has that look of, but it was more about. I was thinking very much about my trips to Greece. So it was, the Odeon at the back, and then there's the sanctuary, and then there is the, which is the sort of main area, if you like. And you're almost, the cellar is almost like where you'd have the symposium. That's where he wrote his last letter, and he was just killed just a few hundred yards away as he crossed the river, one of the last battles of the war. So, but also the idea is it can be, the work can be added to. So the jukebox element of the work, which is the projection, there are animations of the text, because I know it's that feeling like audiobooks. Some people don't like audiobooks, but I can completely understand if you're very dyslexic, then audiobook, or you're blind. I can see why audiobooks are very useful. But also, the problem is some people are lazy and they like audiobooks because somebody is telling them how to interpret a novel. And so when you have somebody, however good, even with sort of Kenneth Branagh, who is the best of the recordings of Owen I've heard, even some people might have problems with that, because their reading of that particular poem is different. So when I asked the French actor to read they're not exactly translations, and you can't translate poetry really. They're what do you call them, transliterations? I'm not quite sure. They're interpretations. I think the person who translated described them as interpretations of the poem, which I think is rather disingenuous, really, to himself. That I felt that the French actor had free rein to interpret them in a sort of different way. Not to listen to the Branagh and mimic the way Branagh interpreted them, but to read the poetry, but to read them in a different way. And so you have the text, and the text is actually animated. I worked with someone, so they are like little films. Although it's apparently just text, each poem has been sort of, if you really pay attention, has been subtly, I don't mean it's like a bouncy ball, like sort of sing along, Wilfred Owen. But it does things quite subtly that in each poem that is sort of, so each the different things relating to early cinema. So it might be a gobo. It might be like the aperture opens up very slowly on Spring Offensive, and it closes down very slowly. So it just it opens up. If you imagine that on the text, so other things, the text is, which poem is it? One is as if he's typing it and it's happening in real time. The poem is happening in real time. So it's not clickety-click, but the words are appearing as they are being spoken. So it feels like it's because it's appropriate to that poem. I just forgot which poem that was. So it's quite sensitive to each work. But the idea is that there could be other poetry, war poets' work, or other poetry in that building, and it can be switched off, so they can use the space, which is only really quite a small space. The community could conceivably use it for something else. They can use the Odeon. Actually, acoustically, it turned out very good for readings. Or you could just sit there and have your picnic. It's a seated area, and it's in the sun. So it is functional in as much. It's ironic because it's a bit like when architects are asked to design an art gallery. It is quite interesting. They love it because it doesn't actually have to apparently have a function. So it's quite an empty space that is sort of uncluttered until the exhibition is in there. And I was always thinking about how poetry, in a way, is one of, like music, is incredibly not nebulous, but transient. It's completely is so ephemeral as a thing, as a medium, but as what it stands for isn't. But as an actual medium, it's so ephemeral. So the idea of creating a physical, concrete thing for poetry, a physical building for poetry sort of tickled me. It seemed slightly contradictory, almost a contradiction in terms, really. And but so it did give it a function, because people often think, well, what use is poetry, or whatever. But actually, the building was sort of giving the poetry a function, and vice versa, really.
I suppose what I began with the thinking was that this work that you had made to tribute Wilfred Owen was a different starting point, in that it was a celebration of somebody, but actually the work, the Great Bear that you did, Deep Purple, and so on, there is a sense of celebration in quite a lot of your work, in recognizing various people who perhaps your alter egos who stand in for you.
I think, it's things you can't, you would like to be. It's like, we'd all, in our dreams, like to be a rock star, or we'd like to be a great cricketer, or, whatever. And, be able to sing really well, or whatever it is that someone's personal, private, secret thing is. And fantasy. So there's an element of, it's a nice way of putting it, celebration. I think it is. I mean, in the case of the Cousteau works, which were originally commissioned for the National show I had at the big show I had at the National Maritime Museum about 9 years ago now, and it was one of the new commissions for there, which was a series of charts that were taking the Admiralty charts that they had in their collection, some of them, and they photographed them for me, and then they were altered so that they still appeared as charts. So what is nice about charts as opposed to maps is that they're kind of negative. It's mapping the ocean, and the land is only put in for reference. So they would put in information about the shoreline, maybe in the margins, because it is useful for navigation, that there's a church tower here, or a castle or something, or there's some high cliffs, or you won't be able to make, there's some dangerous rocks or something immediately there. But essentially it's a blank space with just soundings written on it, and the occasional warning about shoals or rocks or whatever. And so these are things that have been made by they're drawn by different hands and different voyages of navigation, been accumulated over the sort of 18th and 19th century in charts. And the Cousteau was something, a sort of childhood thing that we grew up with, but you mentioned to many people now and they probably wouldn't know what you're talking about. And what I found most interesting was when I was trying to find books on Jacques Cousteau, very hard to find any books on him. So I was going around second-hand shops in France and getting a lot of these annuals, and they're pretty cheesy annuals that were spin-offs from the TV series. And some of his books I'd got via the internet. And he was somebody that he lived many lives in one life. So apart from the fact he lived a double life, he had lived with virtually a bigamous relationship, which chimes in with Grey Owl, who had a bigamous marriage and marriages, and but he was also, he invented the aqualung. He was a war hero. He pioneer of conservation. Proposed at that time when we were all obsessed about the space program in the late 50s, just before the first space flight, just before Sputnik. There was loads of fascination, and even after that, I remember, especially in sort of boys' comics and boys' annuals, there were things of like underwater cities, and we could be living underwater. This is what we'll be doing. We'll be farming. Going out in our sort of diving bell and farming the oceans, which is what Cousteau talked about. And he did build this sort of experimental. It was equivalent of Soyuz, where they continuously manned this underwater sort of house that was off Monaco in very deep water, and broke all sorts of amazing records. So there's this kind of same excitement going on about the sea at the same time as the space program. So there were all these aspects of Cousteau. So I wanted to make a work that was, I didn't know how I was going to do it, but when I arrived at the idea of charts, it was a way of making a biography. How would you make a biography about someone? So I wanted to make it as a sort of biography, but when there's so much missing information. And most of the information I found was on the internet. And I thought, well, that's how I'll make the work. It's through the internet. There's all those Wikipedia mistakes, all those different entries where someone says his date of birth is this and somebody gets his date of birth wrong, and it's where somebody, as you can't find them, it's that whole thing of people who you try and look up before the internet, artists who, say contemporary artists who died before the internet really kind of took off, and you can't find any information on them. Someone will eventually go back, a bit like Wikipedia pages, will eventually go back and research them, but there isn't really the same scholarship. So it's why I've sort of always hated that medium, but actually thought, well, why not use it then? So use that material on Cousteau. So I was looking at different aspects of his life, and each one, it might be just about people who've made songs about Jacques Cousteau. So there were about 26 of these panels. So if you got the stairwell towards the, in this exhibition, there are just 4 of these charts out of a series of, there are 20, as I say, 26 of them, just chosen pretty much at random, the ones we have. So it might be his death, so his burial in Notre Dame, and what everyone's tributes to him were. Or his campaign against the French dumping of nuclear waste as part of their nuclear weapons program, where he created in the, I think it was in the early 50s, he managed to create a mass protest where even, where women and children were sitting on the railway lines and preventing the train that was going to come and dump it. And he was a very brave man. I mean, he was not only personally very brave, physically brave in the sense he diffused mines after the war. I could go on and on about Cousteau, but he's a fascinating character. They're sort of narrative, but they're not narrative. It has bits of information about him. I'm filling in lots of things at each subject of, how you make a biography about someone. But it's also about myths, so it also includes snippets from the Odyssey, which I thought were appropriate to each part of his life. So it's sort of doing 2 things at once. It's several things at once in terms of reading. So you're reading it in the way you read an artwork with text on it, but you're also looking at it because even more than a work like The Great Bear, where it's what you've left out. People say, why did you put that footballer in and not that footballer? I would have put that one in, or I'm making a certain connection from one along a line, certain names in that case. You're making connections of, say, saints, and you say, well, suddenly it jumps to something else, but it makes sense. Why is it making this leap rather than just making it's not always being linear, it's sometimes working across. So it's about how you read and you look at something. So obviously I'm using words, but trying to use them in a more visual way. So whether it's proper nouns or actual sentences in the case of the Cousteau work, Cousteau in the Underworld. So It's the same process as this exhibition, I hope, that it's about you filling the gaps. It's the viewer completes the work, and it also is what keeps changing the work. So it isn't about creating confusion, it's about creating other possibilities. So there isn't a reading. I think people get confused when they worry that there is a particular reading. There's my possible reading, which might be initially my intention, but then, as we were talking about earlier about your question, it was a very appropriate question about the starting point in relation to what you start with and what the work becomes. Hopefully, the intention is interesting, it informs, but it isn't the reading of the work. So it's quite interesting to know about what artists' intentions are, what they meant to do, but it's much more interesting to find out why it isn't that what they intended it to be. Because it's the nature of meaning anyway, it's always in shifting, and it's constantly being affected by the next thing or events.
Can I ask you a question which is about being affected by conditions, really? When I came to listen to you giving a tour around your exhibition, you talked about the fact that you couldn't afford a studio in London.
Yeah.
And that rang a bell. And in terms of the condition of how it is to be a practicing artist now, today, and can you talk about navigating the financial conditions, particularly in relation to students who are beginning and...
I think that it's still possible to have a studio. I think it's just on the scale of there's a problem when you have been making work for a certain amount of time, you accumulate work. So it's as much a problem it's more a problem of storage, I think. So it's incredibly boring, but when artists meet at private views, I think this is quite symptomatic of, it's absolutely appropriate to your question. When I now go to an opening, it used to be artists would have a good old moan about their galleries. You know, it would be, what percentage are they taking? Are they doing enough for you? You know, they're giving too much attention to the artist that's doing really well at the moment. There's usually these kind of things that artists used to moan about. Now the thing is about the price of storage, is the price efficiency, it's about the price of storage, which I find hilarious. That's because maybe it's just because most of the artists I hang out with now, I know, are more around my age or a bit older, because I was a bit younger than a lot of people when I started out in my generation. That it is something as prosaic as that, because it sounds stupid, but you accumulate, by that point you've accumulated, even if you make incredibly ephemeral work, you've got your archive, you've got all sorts of things, certain objects which they can't all be digitized. But in terms of a studio, I think a studio I've never worried about so much. I was very lucky. I started, my whole career has been backwards in terms of studios. It's been starting with massive spaces and going down to really quite tiny spaces. And it's just the nature of the gentrification of London, which artists, or big cities artists, are part of that problem. They can't, unfortunately, they go into areas usually first, and because they're looking for buildings to work in, that they're willing to put up with places that are kind of rat infested or, not really, unheated and leaking roofs and so on, because they need the space to make work. And now those spaces don't really exist because every square inch is being developed. There was a time when artists could do something else I know one artist who won the Turner Prize, and she was waitressing pretty much a few months up until doing that. People have this perception, if you're famous, you're therefore rich. And if you're successful and you're showing everywhere. But it's often artists we've never heard of that are making loads of wonga. So it's quite specialist artists that are really the very wealthy ones. It's very few contemporary artists make more than just a living out of it. It's very up and down. And I think you have to be in it for the long term if you're a younger artist. We were encouraged when we were at Goldsmiths by tutors like Michael Craig Martin people have a slight misunderstanding about what this perception about what became known as the YBA, that was first coined in Art Monthly as a term, that this sort of generation of artists, that everyone assumed were all from Goldsmiths, but it just was the right time. You know, there's also artists from Royal College and from Slade and all sorts of places. But it was mainly initially a London phenomenon, and then there was the Glasgow thing that was happening as well, sort of simultaneously. That I think there was, sorry, going back to the point that there was a slight misunderstanding of what Michael Craig Martin was sort of encouraging. He wasn't turning and saying we all had to be entrepreneurs and go around with sort of file of faxes then and be sort of wheeler dealers, but he was just trying to say you needed to be a bit more professional about it, rather than if it was no longer it was just the end of where people could go to university who didn't have a private income. So there were people there who had a private income who were studying art. It's always been the way, or had some kind of family support. But there were still people there who maybe came from more working class backgrounds or from poorer backgrounds who were knew they had to they couldn't do it as something they did on Sunday, this very English thing. They had to do it professionally, in the sense they had to do it as a way to support themselves. It was no longer possible, which people thought was really dirty and disgusting, and that we were somehow Thatcher's children. I would say we didn't really have much choice, because there was no longer the opportunities that there were. The welfare state had gone. You couldn't sort of sign on and be an artist, for example. You couldn't get a teaching job, because there were very few. You could almost guarantee it felt like you could just sort of give up and go and build your house somewhere in the countryside and marry a former student or something in the teaching job, which seems to be the usual thing. But there weren't those opportunities, so you had to exhibit and try and sell things. With the Frieze exhibition that Damien Hirst curated, that I was one of the artists in, some of us were still at college when that happened, and some of us did sell some work from that and got some exhibitions. I got my show at the Third Eye Centre, that's now DCA, in DCA or CCA? CCA, sorry, in Glasgow. So there were some great things that came out of it, but it was more of a slow burn. There were a few people supporting us then, like Carsten Schubert and Maureen Paley was very supportive. They were both very, very supportive, partly through connections with Michael Craig Martin saying you should come, and he was very good about getting people to come and see the Frieze exhibition. So in a more general sense, sort of advice to younger artists is I think the most important thing to do is to stick together, because there's that whole moment when something exciting happens when you're at college, and there's that energy, and then when you leave, because of practical problems about where you live, some people are obviously returning to another city or another country even, but now it's possible to keep in touch with each other and through social media and so on. So it is possible to organise exhibitions, and even though there's nothing necessary to hold you together other than the fact that you're a bunch of mates, I think it's a really good way of exhibiting, because you're more likely to be noticed as a group. And you can sort of self-organise and you can find a space somewhere. It's harder to find spaces, but I think that's the only way you can aim to do. The important thing is to actually exhibit. And if you sell anything, that's a bonus. But unfortunately, it is a case of most likely you will have to be doing something for a while to support yourself, because there are also, I know one artist who did something very clever. He's not very good at doing applications for grants, and I can't blame him. It's sort of like watching paint dry, trying to apply for these things. They're filling out the forms, writing these statements, mission statements. It's before which isn't the way artists think. You're trying to write what the work is. It's a bit like one of these practice theory PhDs. You have to come up with the outcome before you've made the work, and which is not the way artists think. They start making the work, and the outcome comes at the end. What is it going to be about? Well, I don't really know. Don't know yet. Well, I'll tell you in a couple of years' time. You're not going to get the funding for that. But my friend, he when he first finally won one of these, bursary or something, he spent the money on employing someone to fill out loads of applications for him, which I thought was absolute genius. I can't mention who it is, but I don't think you'd mind me saying, but I better not. But I thought that was an absolute genius thing to do. So he's now got, it's kind of snowballed. So he is actually getting residencies and so on. And which I think is I think steal that idea. I think it's a really good idea. And how do you it's really hard. I don't know. It's very difficult. I think if you can find, even if it's for you're finding a studio space and working with some people for a while, I think that is very helpful. It's easier to do still in places like Leeds and so on. There's still spaces you can find, and I think that's partly why the art scenes seem to be more interesting as you go out of London now, like Manchester and places. But even there, that will inevitably be all sort of flats, and so on. But at the moment, I think art usually thrives in recessions. I think it's where the more interesting things happen, and it usually gets quite bloated in times of plenty. That's when all the money comes involved, and you get the blingy art that is sort of nonsense, but goes for kind of ridiculous money at auction. But it's a sort of no one will ever remember it. Some of these artists in 100 years' time. I mean, who remembers Lord Leighton? He was the biggest thing since sliced bread in his day, particularly his paintings. But so it's I think the important thing is, I think, just to be able to, if you can find a way to just keep making the work, that's a victory in itself, and the rest will follow. It just take time.